afternoon and welcome back to many of you to the 2022 Hibernian Lecture at the University of Notre Dame. It's been 3 years since we've hosted this event in person, and while we did just fine online, it is wonderful to have so many of you back on campus and to see you all face to face again. My name is Kathleen Sprose-Cummings. I'm the director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and a professor of American Studies and History here at Notre Dame. I'd like to welcome and acknowledge a few people joining us today. First, I want to thank the Cushwa staff, Shane Ulbrich, Madonna Noak, and Philip Byers for all that they've done to help prepare this lecture, and also the staff and fellows of the Keogh-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, which is the co-sponsor of this afternoon's lecture. I especially want to thank Professor Patrick Griffin, the director of the Keogh-Naughton Institute, and the Madden Hennebray Family Professor of History at Notre Dame. Patrick was our Hibernian lecturer in 2003. Yes, I had to look that up because it didn't seem like it was that long ago, but indeed it was. Also with us is Professor Colin Barr. Where's Colin? He was just oh, there he is, right there, helping with the mics. Now, many of you will remember that Colin delivered the 2020 Hibernian Lecture online, our first Zoom Hibernian Lecture. This past year, Colin was appointed Professor of Modern Irish History in the Keogh School and Director of the Klingon Family Center for the Study of Modern Ireland. I'd like to extend, of course, a very special welcome to the members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians and the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians who are with us today. Just a bit of history. In December 1977, University of Notre Dame President Father Theodore M. Hesburgh and AOH President John Kane first announced the Hibernian National Board's plan to establish an endowment at Notre Dame's new center devoted to the study of American Catholicism, led by Professor J.P. Dolan. And I had a peek there. You might be seeing more of Professor Dolan in just a minute. For 4 decades and counting, the Hibernian support has enabled the Cushwa Center to promote the study of Irish and Irish-American history and culture in a variety of ways. We offer research awards each year to support publication in the field, and our conferences regularly feature topics in Irish-American history and the global history of Irish Catholicism. Of course, the centerpiece of the Cushwa Center's commitment to this area has long been this annual Hibernian Lecture. And I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Enda Delaney as our lecturer for this afternoon. Professor Delaney holds a personal chair in modern history at the University of Edinburgh, where he has served as director of research for the School of History, Classics, and Archaeology. He specializes in modern Irish history, teaches courses and publishes on the Great Famine, emigration, Irish ethnic identity, the Irish Revolution, and the transnational history of Ireland. His broader interests include the history of human cognition and culture, as well as the relationship between empire and environment in the Anthropocene. Professor Delaney has published 4 co-edited volumes and 5 monographs. I'll just mention a few: The Curse of Reason, The Great Irish Famine, The Irish in Post-War Britain, Irish Immigration Since 1921, and Demography, State and Society, Irish Migration to Britain, 1921 to 1971. His most recent monograph was The Great Irish Famine, A History in 4 Lives, and in 2019 he added a volume on the Irish Revolution titled The Irish Revolution, 1919 to 1921, A Global History. In 2021, Professor Delaney completed a 3-year research project on the global history of the Irish Revolution, 1916 to 1923, through Queen's University Belfast and the UK Research and Innovation Group. He is currently working on a book entitled The Rise and Fall of the Human Empire, an Environmental History of the Anthropocene. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Delaney to our campus today to speak to us on faith and fatherland, belief, and the Irish Catholic experience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Enda Delaney.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Cummings. You're going to be hearing about Edinburgh a lot more over the next couple of days for obvious reasons, for events that have happened in Britain. The city will be, I think, the first port of call for the ceremonies associated with the death of Queen Elizabeth. So it's going to be in the news for other reasons rather than the university. But anyway, can I first thank Professor Cummings for such a wonderful introduction, but also all the staff at the Cushwa, including Madonna Noak and Shane Ulbrich, who've made this visit such a wonderful experience, but also my very good friends at the Keogh-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, in particular Professor Patrick Griffin, Beth Bland and Mary Hendrickson. who have always extended a warm welcome to me, either virtually or in real, when I come to South Bend. So I'm really appreciative of all that they do for Irish Studies here. But I'd also like to thank the sponsors of the Hibernian lecture, the Ancient Order of Hibernians and the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians, which enables someone like me to cross the Atlantic and to tell you what I think about belief and the Irish Catholic experience. So just moving on, today I want to try and answer a very simple question. How important was belief in the Irish Catholic experience, both for the Irish at home and the global Irish, that is, those who settled outside of Ireland and subsequent generations, many of whom I guess are represented in the audience today? It's a very appropriate question to ask here at Notre Dame, with its strong commitment both to its Irish heritage and indeed global Catholicism. This is part of a wider project that I've just finished on Making Ireland Modern, which looks at changes in Irish society from the late 18th century right through to the early 20th century. And while we know a lot about the sort of political nature of those changes leading to the end of British rule in Ireland, this project is primarily looking at the social and cultural dimensions. So a few definitions just to get us going. I won't be too boring about them, but they are important in this context. I guess I don't need to come here and say what faith is, but just in case, and if there's any theologians in the audience, please excuse me, confidence in God and a supernatural presence. Okay, these are fairly shorthand definitions. Belief, which is the one which I'm primarily concerned with, the trust that the believer places in God, and I'm particularly interested in how this shapes everyday life and how it shapes how people see the world around them. And the last element, which has been probably the most studied, and that is practice. So observing the duties or rights of a church for Catholics is predominantly focused on Mass and other sacraments such as confession. So this seems like a very sort of simple question, how important was belief? But if you were to turn it around and ask another question, how important was practice, I could probably give you the answer in 10 minutes, save you all a lot of time listening to me droning on. But in fact, belief is a much more complex thing, because we have to, in a sense, a lot of it is intuitive on the part of a historian, because there's people generally, unless they're very high elites, don't tend to write about their beliefs. They don't tend to put them into memoirs or autobiography. So when we're dealing with ordinary people, and that's who I'll be mostly concerned with this afternoon, we have to, in a sense, to draw on lots of different sources and build up a picture. I'd like to pay a tribute to a wonderful generation of scholarship on the history of Irish Catholicism and across the Irish world. In a sense, I'm resting on the shoulders of others, including people like Cara Delay, Sarah Roddy, and of course Colin Barr, who Kathleen has mentioned earlier on, now at Notre Dame, amongst many others. But we do have some guides to help us to answer that question. And 1985 was a very fruitful year in terms of studies of Catholic experience. Two books appeared. One that I don't think need to spend too much time on here, because many of you will be familiar with, Jay Dolan's wonderful book, The American Catholic Experience, which, for those of you who don't know, Jay Dolan was the founder, director of the Cushman Center, and really the sort of star of the history of American Catholicism in the 70s and 80s and right through into the 90s. It's a beautifully written account, and what he's interested in is there is an element of looking at bishops and episcopal politics, but he's primarily interested in what did Catholicism mean for ordinary people. So that book you will all be familiar with, and I was rereading it preparing for lecture, and it really does stand the test of time. It's a beautifully written book, and raises, as all the best books do, more questions than it does answers. So it's definitely worth sort of revisiting. The other book, which would be less familiar to most of you, but well known to Irish historians, is Monsignor Patrick Corish's The Irish Catholic Experience, which was published in 1985 as well. I have a deep connection both with this book and indeed the author. Patrick Corish retired from the chair of history at Maynooth College in 1988, in the same year that I started my undergraduate degree there. And his legacy lived on in the department because he had more or less shaped the department, and as the department developed, I think largely built on the work that he had done. He was a former president of Maynooth, a kind and gracious scholar who did not suffer fools gladly, and he was a very familiar sight around the campus in Maynooth because he was resident there, but also his major occupation, apart from writing histories and doing the archives, was tending to the college garden, which was quite substantial in Maynooth. And he completed, during this time after his retirement, the official history of the college, which was published in 1995, a book that tells you, in a sense, it's a fairly critical account, a critical insider's account, because he obviously was an insider, and he had access to all the archival. And I think that's an important point about Monsignor Corish, but equally about J. Dolan. These are not uncritical commentators on the history of Catholicism. So Professor Corish, in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, which is the sort of main source for what you find out about people, there's a line in it which I'll just read to you very briefly, and I think it sums him up very well. An academic without episcopal ambitions, he never wanted to be a bishop, which, understandably maybe. Corish was notably unsqueamish about gaps between the ideal and reality in Catholic history. So he was well aware of the sort of limitations and the problems. And the author goes on to say, this should not detract from his fundamental commitment to Catholicism and belief that understanding history involved necessary spiritual maturation. And this book, I think, was really a landmark because, like the earlier one the other one by J. Dolan, he does have bits, coverage of episcopal policies, but he's also very deeply interested in everyday experiences of Irish Catholics. And I think that probably comes from his background. He came from a relatively humble background in Wexford, in the southeast of Ireland. So he's not just interested about what a particular archbishop did, he does cover that, but he's also interested in what Catholicism meant for people. And maybe this is something we can explore in the questions. Obviously, he's coming at it from a position of deep faith, and that naturally enough influences how he sees the world. There's one other thing which I'll just mention, and this is across the Catholic world, not just in Ireland or indeed in the United States, but there's a shift across the English-speaking Catholic world from a faith based on community and family transmission. And what I mean by that is that you learn about your religion and your religious practice from within your community and from within your family, to one which is centred on the institutional church dogma, and there's relatively little allowance for local customs and traditions. So the process that I'm going to describe for Ireland isn't unique to Ireland in any respect, moving away from sort of locally based customs and traditions to one that if you're a Catholic, you can go into any particular place in Ireland and you'll find there's a sort of uniformity about that. And it's sometimes described as the Romanization of Catholic belief and practice, where, in a sense, the edicts come out of Rome about what people do, and then it's up to the bishops to sort of enforce that locally. One of the things I find hardest in my sort of everyday job when I'm not swanning around the United States is with our students trying to emphasize the importance of belief in everyday life. I think if you look at the long run of history, and Kathleen very kindly mentioned the book that I'm working on, if you look at, there's always been a central belief in some sort of a supernatural presence, obviously a God in more recent times, and that isn't compartmentalized. That isn't something that you just said that's in one box and you have something else in another box. That influences how people see the whole world around them, and that might sound slightly trite, but it's a sort of a central organizing principle for how people see the world, and that in our world that is obviously very different. And trying to sort of communicate that, particularly to students, that this is how everyone up till more or less everyone up till certainly the late 19th century and into the 20th century, this is how they understood the world. So historians have struggled to explore religious belief amongst ordinary people for some of the reasons which I mentioned earlier on. The challenge is fairly substantial, and it's even more substantial in Ireland, given it was predominantly an oral and Irish-speaking culture up until the mid-19th century. We can have a debate about how many people spoke Irish, but the culture, certainly up to the early to mid-19th century, the everyday culture, not the was predominantly oral and in many places Irish-speaking. And what I mean by that is there's no cache of records that I can just sort of drop into and find out all the information about belief. One way which historians in other contexts, and indeed in the Irish context, have sort of got around this problem is looking at sort of catechisms. These were books of basically teachings for Catholics. This is one that I've just sort of picked from many. As you can see, the catchy titles were not in vogue at that time. The Christian's Guide to Heaven, or Manual of Spiritual Exercises for Catholics, certainly wasn't going to have people rushing to it. And that was published in many editions right throughout the 19th century in Ireland. It was a conventional sort of Catholic prayer book with devotional prayers and rosaries and all forms of it. Now, the issue about using that as a source is that for a culture where literacy levels are quite low in the early 19th century, the way in which much of the content for that would be communicated would primarily be through sermons, which are given by priests. So it's primarily a sort of second-hand transmission. So what I'm basically saying is I can't just look at that, take all the sort of material from that and say that's what people believed, because there's no sort of direct relationship between the two. Whatever the specific method of instruction, there was no uncertainty about the centrality of belief. Agnostics were rare, and atheists even rarer in Ireland, especially until the latter part of the 19th century. And even then, they were concentrated amongst the upper and upper middle classes. To declare either publicly was tantamount to heresy and very, very dangerous. Everyone in Ireland, more or less everyone, as far as we can tell, believed in God, whatever that precise calibration of the ultimate path to salvation actually meant. The divisions in Ireland, which we're all very familiar with, centred on finer theological points, not the existence of God and other world, but that didn't mean, of course, that they were any less vicious. One method of understanding the complexity of religious belief is to look at everyday life and to see to what extent these popular attitudes and practices tell us about belief systems. This is, again, looking at it in a slightly, from a remove. So whether people are praying at a holy well or attending a patron, what does that actually tell us about their worldview? We know for sure that social control and fear standing out was a factor, especially in tight-knit rural communities, less so in the emerging towns and cities of Ireland. One source a lot of historians have gone to were travel writers. Travel writers seem to be tripping over each other to recount. There's sort of a market for misery tourism, you might call it, in the Irish case. And what they tend to tell us a lot is about the external and visible manifestations of piety. So things that they notice. They're often in the country for very short periods of time. So what stands out to them, a bit like any travel guide, what stands out to immediately, they tend to say. And one of the things which they often, many of them say, is that when they were observing the Irish Catholics, the use of sayings in the name of God, or in entering a house, God save all here, or in Irish, the blessing of God be here, these sayings peppered everyday conversations. So when someone entered the house, someone would say, God save all here. And this, certainly for many travel writers, this showed that at least there was a sort of a superficial attachment to belief. But in a society where minor illness could result in death, and many of the people that I'm interested in and primarily focusing on poorer people, their chances of surviving illness or indeed some other misfortune were indeed much more limited than the elites that we know a lot more about. And you could see why they wanted to have God on their side by invoking him on entering a house, because their chances of something happening to them were much higher than other groups. Secondly, and more potentially problematic about the travel writings is that many of them came from English-speaking Protestant countries, Britain and the United States. And I find surprising, but you may not, is that for an intellectual elite who placed such great store in knowledge and enlightenment, there was an astonishing lack of curiosity about the degree to which Catholicism infused the minds of the faithful. So these, in a sense, are coming to report on what they see, but to a large part, I think they've arrived at the conclusions about Irish Catholicism before they even hit the country. They're sort of, basically the assumption is that Irish Catholics were duped by a religion grounded in superstition and sorcery, and in a sense that this was the greatest con going, and they often, one of the things which they're often doing is they're often looking to find sort of gaps in knowledge when they're talking to people, or trying to see to what extent do people actually understand the key elements of their faith. Another measure that's typically employed, or type of source material for historians, is looking at attendance at religious ceremonies, which is pretty helpful measure of trying to understand how religious people were. In Ireland, the legacies of penal legislation, together with the shortage of priests, meant that the opportunities to attend Mass were much more limited in the 18th century and into the early part of the 19th century. And there's no doubt that, particularly in the early 19th century, there are low rates of attendance, particularly in the west and northwest of Ireland, where priests were thin on the ground and churches were few and far between. And this was used by David Miller, I think the American historian, in a slightly cack-handed way to say, when 20th century Ireland said we've always been a long sort of religious society. Actually, you weren't. In the 1830s and 1840s, there's low rates of mass attendance. But I think, particularly in the West and in the Irish-speaking areas, yes, attending Mass was mostly a minority pursuit. The evidence suggests that maybe a third of Catholics attended weekly Mass, sometimes lower. But largely that was to do with the practicalities of actually getting to a church. It's not as if people didn't want to attend. It's the fact that in many places there weren't the priests to say the Masses, and indeed in parts of the west of Ireland, communications weren't developed enough for people to to be able to make it. So if we accept Miller's, sort of conclusions about Mass attendance rates, and there's been sort of chipping away at his argument, but no one's really sort of, destroyed it completely. What we find that is in these areas, particularly in the west and northwest, but throughout the country, popular religion is a blend of practices associated with stations. That was where the priest nominated a particular house, and the priest would go to the house, and the locals would come to the house, often receiving communion and obtaining confession as well. That was a way in which, in geographically very disparate sort of areas, that was a good way to in a sense, to ensure that people had some connection with the church. But there's also all sorts of events every year, say Bridget's Day, Midsummer Lunacy, made famous by the playwright Brian Friel, and so on, which are essentially pre-Christian, but they're grafted on with Catholic practices during the 18th and 19th century. I have someone that some of you would be familiar with, Alex de Tocqueville, goes to Ireland in 1835. He's more famous, I think, for his books on America than he is for his visit to Ireland. But and he goes and he meets this priest in the west of Ireland who says that he's got 10,000 parishioners, which is no small number for one person to look after. And he says of those 10,000 quite confidently, he only knew one adult who did not confess. Now, I don't know how he could manage that, but and when he went into it in detail, I was very skeptical of this. It turned out that when it came to confession, he conducted them with almost industrial efficiency, travelling throughout his parish during the biannual visitations to each of the villages to hear confessions. So I guess from this priest's point of view, that's what he saw as his duty, not necessarily dealing with a community every week, but getting out there to hear confessions. And the most visible manifestations of piety were at the rites of passage, especially but not exclusively at the time of death, as Catholic funerals were very elaborate, and often travel writers commented on that, including keening, that is the public laments for the dead, sometimes by people who are actually employed to do it, by women who are employed to do it. The folklorist Garrett O'Crualoch sees the wake, which is another sort of ceremony associated with death, as a combination of the supernatural and the social needs of families to mark the passing of a loved one. And the wake, I think, is an interesting example, because in a sense, what's unusual about it is the priest is sort of marginal in the whole experience. It's something which is undertaken by the families and the loved ones. It does involve, as it still does in Ireland, a certain amount of merriment and alcohol consumption and but it's primarily about remembering the person and offering consolation to their relatives. So I suppose the point that I'm trying to make so far is up on about the 1840s, 1850s, when the Great Famine hits, religious belief was a composite of custom, tradition, and officially sanctioned activities. Adherence to the stipulated requirements was mixed, to say the least. Faith could be infused by cultural practices as well as doctrinal requirements. And I think if you looked at many other societies across Europe, you would find very, very similar sort of. And there's a blurring of the sacred and the blurring of the sacred and secular worlds of the faithful. But in a sense, that was the deeply immersed culture of that society. Over the next half century, these distinctions were brought into sharper focus across all the main religious groups, but for my interest today, particularly for Catholics, regular attendance, strict observance, and outward expressions of piety were the new order of the day. And any deviations from these requirements were seen as a challenge to the moral and spiritual authority of the Almighty himself, who of course was Irish, and I'm joking, but came from an Irish background. So there's a key change in the mid-19th century about what were regarded as the appropriate ways in which Catholicism was practiced. A lot of that reflects other key changes in Irish society at the time as the British state extends its influence across through policing and education and so on. I'm going to pick out a number of sort of things that are part of that change. One is the growth in personnel. There's simply more priests and less people. Maynooth College, who I mentioned earlier on, is educating quite significant, although there's other training seminaries as well. All Hallows is set up not alone just to train priests for elsewhere. I mean, there's a sort of excess of priests. Not only do you have enough priests for Ireland, you can actually send them all across, and Colin has done some great work about how that sort of, I don't know if you call them mafia, but certainly how all those Hibernian priests go across the world. So that's one key thing, that it's there's just more priests and the infrastructure develops to a greater extent. There's another element, which that religion becomes a public demonstration of faith, both for Catholic and Protestants. In expressing his preference for medieval Catholicism over modern humanitarianism, the great Irish poet W.B. Yeats noted ruefully that at one time men were thinking about their own sins, and now they're thinking about other people's. And I think that was a very neat way of sort of summarising the difference over time. So why did this new order develop in Ireland after the 1840s, 1850s? Emmett Larkin, the Chicago-based historian's famous account of the devotional revolution, now 50 years old and still holding its ground largely, he argues that's to do with the guilt, the dislocation, the alienation, the loss of the Irish language and Anglicisation. So he sees the sort of growing attachment to Catholicism and the rights of Catholicism as being, in a sense, triggered by Anglicisation, the sort of creeping influence of British values, but also, well, in particular, the loss of the Irish language. In other words, Catholic religious devotion offered a communal sense of identity when other elements of identity, such as language and culture, were fast disappearing. So into that space came this sort of new Catholicism, disciplined, universal, and orthodox, and it provides a central core of identity. That argument, I'll just park that for a second, it's a fairly influential one. I want to mention another one that is less cited, which I think, to me, appears pretty persuasive, but you may have different views, and that's fair enough. It's by the historian David Noel Doyle. He argues that in Ireland in the early 19th century, there were two types of Catholicism. One which I've sort of just described, Western and Outer Ulster model, which the most emblematic character of that, I think, was Archbishop John McHale of Tuam, which centred on communal transmission, to quote him, in the Catholic rural neighbourhood, a uniform Christian culture, and moral constraints were so pervasive that pastor and family were believed largely sufficient to the transmission of the faith. So that's basically the sort of model that I was talking about earlier on. The second model, associated primarily with Leinster and Munster, the most anglicised parts of Ireland, and embodied in Cardinal Paul Cullen, focused on the systematic indoctrination of the faith through education and rigorous orthodoxy. And his argument, and I think it's one I agree with, is it was this approach which was to prove dominant in Ireland from the mid-19th century and across Irish diasporic communities. Oops, sorry. There are a number of key elements to some of which I've mentioned already, but others I think include church building, which is funded in some part by immigrants who send back money. That wasn't certainly an unusual thing. Another element I think is the internalization. If I can just show you one slide. That's the outdoor masses, and there's one just up here. Sorry, that's it there. This is a church which is established in 1842 in Bray in County Wicklow. It's called Church of Little Bray. There's a very deep personal connection for me for that church. That's the church I got married in. It still more or less looks exactly the same, and obviously I'm not that old. I wasn't that married that long, but it's still a relatively refined sort of with statues and relatively adorned church. And in a sense, those sorts of churches become the model in the 19th century. And contrary to what I was just flying through some of these earlier on, where you have a very much an outdoor religious culture, priests saying mass in the mountains, or this one here, open air mass in County Donegal in 1867. Faith becomes associated with the physical manifestations of the church. Religious imagery, we know about that, particularly the best example I think is obviously the crucifix, which becomes a sort of central element. And priests, as I was saying earlier on, are a very important agent for these changes right throughout the 19th century. One thing which I'd sort of flag up as well is the importance of landscape. There's been a really good book which I think has been unduly neglected by the Notre Dame historian Kevin Whelan about landscape and religion in modern Ireland. And that's one of the arguments I think that Kevin Whelan makes very effectively is how popular religious practice is imbued in that landscape, whether it's mass rocks, whether it's particular sites of memory, and he traces this through from prehistory up onto the present day. Good example of that are patrons. So on the feast day of a patron saint, the locals would gather at a holy well or ruins of a monastery or some site and celebrate the patron that was called the patron in a fusion of pre-modern communal values and religious devotion. If I can just show you one image, sorry, my slides aren't as well. This is the famous image from by Joseph Peacock in 1813 at Glendalough of a patron. They get a bad name for all sorts of reasons, not least because as the day progresses, and this probably won't surprise you, there's more drinking, there's more sort of merriment, and by the end they usually end up in some sort of a riot, and all the respectable people have well gone by that time. The diarist Humphrey O'Sullivan said, we went to the local patron, but we made sure we were out of there by the afternoon because he knew by the evening it would. And there was often faction fights and all sorts of things going on. Now you might say, well, that's an important part of the culture. There's a religious element, but there's also another element, and there's that sort of fusion. But of course, the thing about the patron was that they were at particular sites, and they were always held outside for the reasons that were discussed. I've mentioned the station, which involved the priests moving around particular parts of the parish. Again, another element of sort of outside culture. And in the diocese of Cashel, when they tried to abolish the Archbishop tried to abolish the station, there's a lot of resistance from the people to that, because it's an important part of their sort of popular culture. So, as Larkin notes, I think it's a good point about the stations. When resources were few, they made sense because they're a good way of promoting practice in a sort of geographically diverse sort of way. Another practice, an outdoor one, which I mentioned, is a holy well. Right across the world, wells and springs were associated with healing and spiritual renewal. What I'm saying is they're not unique to Ireland by any sense. In Britain, after the Reformation, many wells fell into disuse. But in Ireland, they retained their importance in the landscape of Catholic belief and practice. Particular wells tend to be associated with particular cures. And it wasn't just for humans, it could be for animals as well. People brought their animals in order to seek a cure using the water that came from the well. What they often did as well was they prayed around the well, but going around in stations, moving around the well, these stations were marked by stone. They drank water, prayed beside it with prayers such as the Rosary, and they often left votive offerings. And you can see those, if you're very good eyesight, you can see it in the images where there's offerings left there, and saw cures for themselves and their animals. And all sorts of supernatural powers were ascribed to the water that the wells contained. One English observer, Edward Wakefield in 1812, was disgusted at the custom of leaving practices of brightly coloured cloth tied to trees. He said that was a practice similar to one common amongst the Negroes of Africa. In a sense, this all fitted into a sort of an image that Ireland was uncivilized and unsophisticated. Others, though, had a more open mind when it came to the wells. Scottish Liberal writer Robert Graham, when he went to a holy well outside the town of Clonmel in County Tipperary in the south of Ireland, he saw the penitents walking around barefooted along the stream to a ruined chapel, and they often tended to be associated with particular sites, and the statue of St. Patrick was in the middle of this marsh. And the faithful rounded, using the process which I just described, the statue on their knees using beads to count the rotations. And interestingly, when he was there, it's called St. Patrick's Well, it was mainly young girls undertaking the privilege, and he found the whole scene, to quote him, exceedingly interesting, because he obviously realised this wasn't a superficial practice, and it was worth reflecting upon. Many of you will know, of course, there's people walked long distances to attend particular popular patterns. Sometimes they drew huge crowds in these particular contexts, and some of them have survived even to the present day, including St. Patrick's Purgatory at Lough Derg, which is still a very active site of retreat and penitence for not just Irish Catholics, but for Catholics across the world. And thousands of penitents made their way to Lough Derg and other places to atone for their sins, using the saints' beds, which aren't necessarily reflected in the image. So the point here is that across the Irish landscape were all sorts of places and objects of sacred significance. Many of them were associated with particular features, but also with religious figures or events. Mass rocks, stones, mass rocks being a legacy from the penal times, where priests being caught saying a mass could have, there's a debate about the extent of the consequences for him, but it could have fatal consequences for a priest. Even paths and tracks were often associated with ancient and modern religious functions. So I'm going to leave that there for a second and move on to something which may be of more interest to this particular audience. And if this faith and Catholic faith and belief manifested itself in particular ways across the Irish landscape, what happened when the Catholic Irish left the country and were removed from all that was familiar from them in terms of people and places? And one thing, despite all the work that's been done on Irish immigration and Irish settlement, it's been very hard to actually get to the root of the dislocation and the sense of alienation that many immigrants experienced when they came to societies which were completely different to the society that they had left. The reason we don't know that much about it because most of these people weren't writing their memoirs or it was a whole new world. So millions of Irish Catholics, as we all well know, left across the 19th and early 20th centuries. And there was a sort of cliched argument that was trotted out on many occasions that as soon as the Irish got out of Ireland, that was an opportunity for them to sort of ditch their Catholicism. This is a sort of a trope that comes up, or a cliche that, if they weren't under rigorous control of the priests as soon as they left, they soon slipped away. And Protestant evangelicals went to extraordinary lengths to demonstrate that many of Catholic beliefs were just superstition and magic. And I think the logic to that, particularly in an Irish context, was, well, these people are only internalizing this to a very limited degree. So in fact, they might be ripe for conversion because they don't actually know, they don't know. I think this is a sort of a long-standing, overhyped sort of thing that if you look actually at the experience of Irish Catholics in the major societies in which they settle, Britain and the United States, you find that actually that isn't the case. There's even Catholic priests, not Irish Catholics, I should say, but Catholic priests. One French priest in New York in 1875 declared the Irish had no clear, explicit knowledge of Catholic doctrines and they often neglected their religious duties prior to leaving the country, sometimes for decades. Well, actually, that fits with what we were talking about earlier on. In a sense, he was right. An English Marist priest living in Spitalfields district of London, when thousands, as he called them, unchurched Irish showed up, declared that they didn't know the most essential truths of our religion, and many had not even received the sacrament of First Communion. So I'm not doubting that that was the case, and clearly particularly for English Catholics who were used to dealing with a very aristocratic audience, and next thing hundreds of thousands of sort of poor Irish show up, there was clearly a pastoral challenge for them. And there wasn't enough priests and chapels to deal with the demand in the 1840s and 1850s. But the response, and I think it's been acknowledged, I'm not the first person to say this, the response to the Catholic Church in the sites of settlement in Australasia and in Britain is actually quite a phenomenal. They managed to use the modern terms, construct an infrastructure very, very quickly in order to deal with a huge number of people coming within a very short period of time. And you see that right throughout places of England that had a handful of Catholics, and next thing, large numbers of Irish are showing up. And the infrastructure, which is very basic, is uprated. That's not really a historical term, but it's put in place very, very quickly. And there's lots of accounts coming back to Ireland of alarmist accounts of the Irish, particularly in the United States, and how they've lost their faith and all that. I'm sure they did come across some people who had lost their faith, but I think largely this is to do with the argument that comes from the Catholic Church in the 19th century, is that people shouldn't be leaving in the first place. By leaving in the first place, there's a large chance that they're going to lose their faith. And that's one of the arguments that's really put forward with strength by the 19th century. Look, don't leave, because if you leave, this is what's going to happen to you. And there's all sorts of devotion or manuals and all that, there's whole paraphernalia telling people that if you do leave, you have to watch out for this and you have to watch out for that in order to maintain your faith. So some of the features which I've described elsewhere in Ireland come into being, about how Irish Catholicism becomes an interior associated with particular churches, and there's been lots of great work done by American historians of Catholicism on parish life, and you can really see there's a sort of parallel process that's going on in the sites of settlement. And as I think one element that is particularly brought up by scholars like Cara Delay is Cara has demonstrated how in the first instance where lay women are particularly excluded due to the nature of the church, they find all sorts of roles and opportunities. She shows, particularly she's interested in Ireland, but how women are involved in particularly associational culture, associations within the church, but also devotional practices. And if you look at what you might call Irish parishes in Britain and North America, you find that as well. In England, priests relied heavily on Irish women to organise events, attend the sacraments and fundraise for the church, as detailed in many studies of the Irish in Britain. And similarly, the work that J. Dolan, his early work on the sort of Catholic parish, I think that emphasises that point as well. As Dolan says, the parish was transformed in American urban context from being a religious institution, and this is a direct quote from him, in which the church was a mass house and not much more, into a community institution. And I think that's a key element of the identity of those particular communities. And with the Irish came the Irish priests, and the Irish priests in Britain and North America were treated with great reverence by the Irish emigrants. And I think that was to do with the sort of being a holy person and being treated with the respect that goes with that. But also they were very effective leaders, and they were very effective mediators between the Irish and the societies in which they're in, whether this is the police or municipal authorities. So they had a very important sacred role as a sacred and spiritual role, but they're also fundraisers, managers of schools, local representatives and interlocutors with the secular natures of the society. And they were often called upon to, particularly in Britain, they're often called upon to sort out fights between Irish between themselves and other groups, because the police couldn't sort them out. So the one person that was called for was the priest. But they're also called out for more, might describe more sort of spiritual things of help cure the ill and assist the dying. E.P. Thompson, the famous English Marxist historian, described the priest as part social worker, peacemaker, and intermediary with all aspects of officialdom. And according to Thompson, for the Irish poor who were torn up by the roots, the Irish Catholic priest was the last point of orientation with their old way of life. So when the Irish Catholics moved abroad, this probably isn't going to shock you, they neither dispensed with the cultural norms of behaviour they had learnt in Ireland, nor wholeheartedly embraced the Protestant values of the receiving societies in which they settled. Migrants negotiated and constantly recalibrated, taking tentative steps into a new social, cultural and economic worlds, but also keeping elements of the familiar. There's the very distinguished historian of American immigration, Oscar Hanlon. He, in his book The Uprooted, he says more or less that once immigrants come, in a sense they're shorn of their cultural baggage. I mean, there's no way that argument would work. You just have to know people to know that is the case, that there's a constant process of negotiation. And when, in the early stages of settlement, to give you an example of this, the Irish in New York, for example, sought to maintain their traditions of waking the dead, taking place in private homes without supervision of priests, and involving that most characteristic fusion of mourning and celebration that was associated with the Irish wake. The funeral itself often did not involve the church, and the deceased was taken from the home to the cemetery. It didn't involve any sort of ceremony at all. By the 1860s, the church authorities were insisting in New York, and I'm sure elsewhere, that the festivities become more respectable and that a mass should be said at the church. And gradually this requirement was accepted by the New York Irish, but Irish wakes continued to take place, and I'm sure it continued to take place up to the present day. So there's the wave of migrants who left Ireland from the 1840s onwards often have to adjust very quickly. But one of the key things which I would argue is that part of that adjustment involves bringing with them the sort of central elements of Catholic belief, and that this, in a sense, is an important part of helping them to negotiate the societies that they settle in. I want to give one more example, and then I realise I'm trying your patience, but one more example, and that is from a priest in London in the 1840s and 1850s. He was a convert, Father William Todd. He was converted. Sorry, I was going to say he's converted by Cardinal Newman, but he was supported in his conversion by Cardinal Newman. And he devoted his life to working with the Irish poor in London. He came from a very well-heeled Protestant family in Ireland. I'm sure he was the source of much shame that he'd ended up sort of dealing with the Irish poor in London. But anyway, he emphasised the centrality of Catholicism for the exiles that he met, and with this came a great respect for the man of God, including a sense of the powers that came with it. He says, the priest is the father and the friend to whom they naturally turn in all their cares and sorrows. He is a friend long tried and never found wanting. And for the Catholic Irish in London, attending Mass often involved great sacrifices, particularly for those in service who couldn't just get up and walk out. They needed the permission of their employer, and making sure their children were baptised. And a point that Todd makes, which I think is borne out by all what we know about people who are in poverty, they will never send away a poor man from their doors without giving him something for the love of God. When I heard it first, it sounded counterintuitive, but every single study I've read is poor are actually more likely to give to other people who are poor rather than other groups. One sort of element which transferred across the Irish Sea, this is Father Theobald Matthew, the temperance campaigner who visited the United States as well as Britain. The reason why I mention him is that when Father Matthew went on his tours, he always said that he had no supernatural powers, he had no healing powers, no curing powers, that his job was temperance. But yet he would attract large crowds who wanted to touch him. And that was a key element. By touching Father Matthew, that would in a sense would help heal people and give them cures. And that, I think, is a key element of the sense of touch and the power of the holy man, which of course it is in this case the priest, to cure by that. I'll give you another sort of quick anecdote. Power of touch also across the Atlantic. As I said, a French missionary priest who worked among the New York Irish in the 1860s and 1870s recorded this story, that when he went to see an elderly Irish woman, she came over to him and said, "Father, my feet are sore, touch them and make the sign of cross over them and I will be cured." In a sense, seeing the priest as a holy person that can cure them. Another sort of element which is quite important from the Irish context was the use of water as a curative. Mentioned earlier on the holy wells, but it wasn't just in Ireland. In Paterson, New Jersey, an industrial town with a large Irish community, the Dublin Spring was a source of supernatural powers, filled as it was with water, quote unquote, that an Irish fairy brought over the water in an apron from the lakes of Killarney and planted it in the humble part of the town. And often many of the Irish would travel around with holy water which had been taken from and see that as a sort of a spiritual guide. An intriguing finding from archaeologists, not from historians, who've looked at places like Five Points in New York City, a very Irish area, but also Paterson and parts of San Francisco, is that they find that there's large numbers of bottles of soda water in these places of Irish settlement, and seeing that, when they basically dig down into the ground, they're able to find that this was a distinctive feature of consumption amongst Irish immigrants in particular. Other Irish practices, many could go on, but I won't, transferred across the Atlantic, including the saying of the Rosary. The Rosary, which of course wasn't an Irish devotion, had vital significance for Irish Catholics at home, and this was maintained when Irish Catholics left Ireland. Another example, I think, is the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, which again is a key sort of devotion. Of course, staying the Rosary within England, Wales and other places in the United States was a long-standing devotion, but was given extra impetus with the arrival of the Irish. And it had a basic simplicity which survives till the present day. It's a simplicity of repetition and without the need to be literate. So it was open to all as a form of devotion. So what I've been arguing here, and hopefully I persuade you, but maybe I haven't, we'll see in a couple of minutes, is that when it comes to looking at practice, we can measure that through churches and all that, and who goes to church and where they go to. Looking at belief is a much more tricky thing for a historian to do, because a lot of it's by inference, and a lot of it's using basically, in many cases, fairly unreliable witnesses to build up your picture. But I think when you build up the picture, you see that it is a central element of the experience of ordinary people, for those who stayed in Ireland and those who were forced to leave. While practice and traditions changed over time, belief was one constant factor for the Irish at home and the global Irish who settled in other places. So I suppose the last thing to address in a minute or two is, why was this the case? It seemed a fairly, I think, to my mind, relief provides certainty in the face of great uncertainty. And many, as an emigrant myself, albeit in the lofty world of academia, it's not quite swinging into New York in the 1840s, but you know that one of the things which people get when they move, even you don't have to move country, is that sort of cultural dissonance. That sense of, this is very unfamiliar, this makes you very, very uncertain. And popular beliefs were transformed and transferred to this new context, whether this was the United States, Britain, or Australia. For Irish Catholics, the faith, and this is the faith of the faith in Fatherland, the title, offered the hope of a better afterlife and solace in the face of trials and tribulations of everyday life in an unforgiving and often, in an unfamiliar and often unforgiving world. I'm going to leave the last word to a road sweeper in London in the 1840s who was interviewed by the great social investigator Henry Matthew. And this is Matthew rather than the road speaker. Matthew says that personal prayer seems to provide this man with a religious comfort and consolation of the simplest and most elemental kind, as it did for the Irish crossing sweeper, whom Mayhew records was a very melancholy looking man, who could not understand the Mass, but who prayed to the saints every night for a blessing, this is how it was put in Mayhew's text, obviously in a phonetic way, and to rise me out of my misery. Catholicism offered dignity in the face of many humiliations, consolation when things went wrong, as they often did for poor people, and they're more likely to go wrong for poor people, and hope when the odds were stacked against you, as they were for the Irish at home and overseas for much of the modern era. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Delaney. That was wonderful. You had a tough act to follow, and we had Professor Barr and Professor Declan Kyberd last year, so you rose to the occasion, and it's a wonderful to have you give the lecture for our first in-person one in a while. So Professor Delaney has agreed to take a few questions, and I'd be happy to moderate them. I know there will be some not too tough, probably.
I'm not taking any from the Keogh Norton Institute for... yeah, okay, I'll turn around this way. They're well-known crowd of troublemakers.
Including the Keogh.
Yeah, am I joking?
Yes, Thomas Hellman.
I really liked the lecture and the distinction that you made at the beginning, or towards the beginning, between the communal and the more dogmatic. And that didn't show up in the later part of the lectures, and I'm wondering, is the continuity that you're arguing for one that is primarily this second, or do you also see elements of the first? And I guess linked to that question, could you say something about the different quality of it? I mean, it seems to me that that's a valuable distinction, but if you could talk a little bit more about the ways in which that works on people in their daily lives in different ways, it might be helpful.
Yep. I did there was a word I just didn't catch in the second, the first, the quality was that?
Yeah, the quality of the experience.
Okay.
As you think about the two different categories you set out.
Yeah, you're quite right. Because of the timing of mass emigration from Ireland, which is 1840s, 1850s, in a sense, the second model, or the first model, the second model, the more dogmatic, more institutional church, that tends to be dominant in the societies with go. But I would add with that in large part that's, we can't be sure, because getting into particularly immigrant communities even today, and knowing how important was, there's no shortage of studies which show there's about communal identity, but the religious aspect of it there doesn't tend to be as much sort of work on that. The second, I'm not sure I quite understand on the quality, is in a sense the sort of spirituality or the...
Yeah, I mean, is belief really different as you move from category 1 to category 2?
I would argue not, that in a sense that's why the practices and what people do and how the manifestations of this change, that the centrality of belief remains more or less the same over the complete period. You don't look convinced.
I'm not.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. I'll come back to you later. I'll convince you later.
Professor Kesselman, who is a professor of French history, who has written a lot about belief in France, so you can have a very interesting conversation, I'm sure. Other questions? Yes, Rory.
Hi. I was just wondering about the question of language here, and the question whether what one might call the more folk-based religion, or the manifestation of that, is somehow simplified because it is placed through a filter of translation. That, let's say if you get a monoglot Irish speaker who has a pain in his liver, and he goes to the hospital and he's trying to speak to an English doctor, he might not know the name for liver. Similarly, there might be a whole vocabulary that is quite sophisticated vocabulary to do with salvation or devotion or all that, which is in the imagination of an Irish speaker, but when he encounters somebody who's over with a notebook from England taking notes, they're not going to be able to sort of talk about, double predestination or something like that in that way. I wonder to what extent that creates a chasm between the doctrinal belief or the doctrinal model, let's say, the model of the catechism and the model of folk religion.
That's a really good point. That in a sense, the observers, what you're saying, Rory, is the sophistication of the observers, or the ability of observers to observe the sophistication of that culture is in fact very limited. Yeah, I mean that's a really good point. It's particularly in a context in which I'll have to choose my words carefully here, but everything is weighted against Irish, both the state, the Catholic Church itself, so that Irish becomes associated with the language of poverty and the language of unsophisticated people. I'm just trying to think of, is there any way of getting around what you're sort of identifying? I suspect one way, I was sort of thinking, just sort of off the top of my head, the work that Vincent Morley has done using Irish texts. Now, these tend to come from scribes and teachers and comes from the lead. That might be one way in which to sort of get a handle on that sort of Irish spirituality.
And I wonder whether folk prayers actually might have doctrinal expressions, lex orandi, lex credendi type vibes of them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I haven't done that, but that's a really good. Vincent's done it for the 18th century, the 19th century, and particularly the early part of the 19th century. I'm just trying to think of work that might be done by people like Neil O'Keeson and others on that sort of Irish language, religious material, and then trying to see if you can sort of pick out some of these points. Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah.
Grania?
Yeah, thanks, Enda, for that. I was really interested in what you were saying about what happens to the wake when immigrants move to the United States. And one thing I find interesting is the idea of faith-based practices, cultural practices, or even material culture in the process of immigration. And so the most obvious example of that is the American wake. So it's obviously called an American wake for a reason, before the era of Aer Lingus and WhatsApp, but it was the day, right, in every country. In the work that you've done, to what extent can you see faith shaping the American wake as opposed to just for cultural practice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the American wake, just when people, before they left Ireland, they had a wake. Obviously, they weren't dying; they were emigrating. But in a sense, this is a key rite of passage and a key rite of departure. I'm trying to think of the sort of the faith-based elements of that. I mean, in a sense, it's a not dissimilar to the other types of wake that I've discussed. That people are will no longer be part of their world. I hadn't thought about it like that. It's a good point. I need to sort of process that a little bit more to see. Clearly there weren't any overt sort of religious, but the mechanisms of the wake were actually very, very similar to what happened when people, in the sense that talking about those who were leaving and the sort of drinking and merriment that goes on. On the American wake, and you probably know more about this than I do, but it does seem that decreases in significance. There's a really good piece, comment by Father Sheehan in the 1880s, when he said that the people who really feel hard done by in Ireland in the 1880s are not the immigrants. The people who feel really hard done by are the ones who have to stay, for familiar reasons so in a sense, he's talking about a cove in Queenstown, that it's those who are waving the immigrants off who are essentially crying because they're left behind. They're not going to have the same opportunities that the immigrants have. So the American wake, which is obviously an important part of cultural, I suspect also that it's sort of, as communications become more developed by the 1870s, the 1880s, there's significant numbers of people who are coming back and forth across the Atlantic including my great-grandfather who emigrated to America. Obviously didn't make a success of it and came back, or maybe he didn't like it, I don't know. But so there's large numbers of people who this sort of view that emigration is a final thing, that's more appropriate for the early 19th century. As time goes on, fares go down, there's agents selling tickets. It's much easier for people to actually come back and forth. And one of the effects that this has, quite rightly remarked upon about priests, was the best advertisement for emigration is a returned Yank. No offence, I don't mean that. But that's the term that, because people see them in their finery and they think, well, I'm going to have to do that. I'm going to have to, so. But there's a lot more movement, I think, by the 1870s, 1880s, which makes me think that the American wake sort of declines in significance.
Julie?
Thank you, that was really interesting. I'd be interested to hear about how you're thinking about belief and practice in very current times, particularly in COVID. I was really interested in the outdoor culture, and one thing that struck me just from my own experience in Ireland was this practice that emerged around funerals, where when funerals were limited to 6 or 10 people, large groups of people would stand socially distanced outside the church. This became very common. And I'm wondering how you would interpret that in terms of the communal and the institutional.
Yep. Ireland had many COVID restrictions, but the one I think which possibly was the most controversial and indeed caused most hurt and most pain were the ones around funerals, where in the culture where, they're saying goodbye, I'm not saying other cultures don't have, but in the culture where that was incredibly important and large numbers of people were attending, there's a sort of, perhaps a classic Irish attempt to subvert those regulations by moving out into sort of outdoor spaces. One thing I've been struck about living in Britain is where funerals are essentially very private affairs, and unless you know someone really, really well, you would never dream of going to their funeral. Whereas in Ireland, funerals are, mass events. And the reason why that's so important is because the people who are the bereaved, that's offered as it's not like a social activity. People are doing it because they want to offer their support to the bereaved in the way in which they do. So it's an interesting that how there's a reversion to the outdoor, and of course the other technological thing, which was the streaming of funeral masses. So I don't have anything to say about the code, but it's interesting that there is a move. But I do know from my own experience, that particular regulation, I think, was seen to want to be. I mean, many regulations subverted norms, but that particular regulation seemed to attract a lot of adverse comment, and I guess people trying to get around it by standing outside. I happened to be at a funeral in Ireland recently, and I noticed there was a lot of people. I wonder, is that continuing on? Say people who were anxious maybe about going into an interior space, they're for health reasons or for other reasons, they were sort of standing around outside the church, and then when at the end of the funeral mass, they were able to sort of participate at that stage. Anyway, so that's maybe a conversation we could have another time.
Please.
So can you offer any insights into the role of faith or belief in the Irish response to the Great Hunger?
Yeah, I can, but I'll do it quite briefly. There's a very interesting account by a priest that Colin and others will know in Kerry. It's a diary of his ministry, basically, during the famine. And what that shows is that he and many other priests throughout the country, and the record of the Catholic Church during the famine, I think, is a very strong one in terms of dealing with people. What they basically do is they're consoling the dying and trying to assist the living in any way they can. There's in a sense a key message which comes across in many of the things, which is one that maybe modern day Catholics would find perhaps not too receptive, that even though your life has been pretty terrible, and these terrible things that have happened, that this is part of your sort of eternal salvation. The first history of the famine that is written is done by Canon John O'Rourke, who's the parish priest of Maynooth, not the college, but in the parish. And he goes to Aberystwyth graveyard in County Cork in Skibbereen. Skibbereen, as you will well know, is one of the most devastated by the famine. And he goes to the graveyard where it's estimated that somewhere in the region of 5,000 to 6,000 people are buried in a pit. And he reflects on it, he writes down what he reflects on it, the way in which he sees it. He said that this is, obviously this was a terrible thing, but that these poor people have now got their eternal reward. Maybe I'm making it sound a bit more brutal than it actually was, but that's, in a sense, that's the sort of message that comes out. I'm wondering, were you sort of hinting that maybe a sort of increased faith or belief, or a sense of how people understood?
I was looking for either how faith manifested itself in the response, or whether there was a diminution in faith because of the great calamity.
That could probably be arguably the other way. I don't think it has that effect that people think isn't God isn't God a terrible creature putting this onto it. I mean, there's an interesting parallel in that the sort of views of the Catholic Church and of Protestant evangelicals during the famine tend to be fairly similar, fairly providential. This is God's, this is what God has decided for us, and we must suffer this and endure that. And that's an interesting argument, which you get both extreme sort of Protestant evangelicals, but also Catholic priests. This lady's been Catholic.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jane. Okay, well, Jane, and then we'll have Ian.
You spoke eloquently about the advantage of the Irish priests coming over. They were the literate ones. They were, in a sense, a stable foot. They were a reminder, and they were a help to the community. In the long run, could you speak of any disadvantages of this in the sense of over-dependence on it, counting on them too much, their own sense of importance?
Yeah, I think the problem, you might say, well, the particular disadvantage is that it encourages a cultural identity. It sort of encourages a cultural identity, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to integrate with other particular Catholics. And there's lots of interesting disputes that take place about churches and with Irish priests seeking to control them, and then the other ethnic priests seeking to. Whether that is, I mean, I guess from the emigrant's point of view, that's an advantage to have a priest, someone of your faith. If you talk to, even today, when you talk to priests about, they tend not to be keen on, so where I live, there's a strong Polish community, and the Catholic Church tends to want the Polish community to come to, not to have their own masses and their own sort of paraphernalia. They tend to want them to integrate within the sort of the sort of Edinburgh community rather than that. So I think there's lots of sort of tensions that go with priests, but I suspect from the emigrants' point of view, they would probably have preferred to deal with someone that they felt knew the cultural background that they came from and knew the faith. But I could obviously see from an institutional point of view, there could be problems as a result of that.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I'm hoping you might be able to extend this a little bit towards Irish America and the construction of Irish America. Part of what you talked about with the shift, obviously with Dolan's work from the religious institution to one of the community institution and the movement of immigrants, of Irish individuals over here. And to an extent, the portrayal you've presented is one of a unified, cohesive whole. And I'm wondering whether you feel that way, or whether it might be a more nuanced view of thinking about multiple communities and formation, be it on the basis of where people came from, there are issues of faith, there are issues of where they're relocated in terms of going to Butte, Montana versus somewhere else. So thinking in terms of if you have an interest and comfort, shall we say, in thinking about the formation of multiple Irish communities.
Yeah, it's a really good point. In a sense, I'm painting with a broad brush, but there's a whole raft of brilliant books about Irish communities from people like Tim Marr in Worcester, Massachusetts, about the DuPont Irish, and what they show is essentially there's an inevitable where people are sort of lumped together as Irish, but actually within the community there's often very, very sharp gradations based, origins is one way in which those socioeconomic status seems to be important. I was just reading a study, bizarrely, coincidentally, about the Irish in South Bend, and even within that relatively small community, I'm talking about in the 1850s, 1860s, and places some of you will know called Sorenville, which is associated with Father Soren, and but even within that community, which is predominantly sort of people, manual workers, there's quite distinctive distinction. The book that really stands out is about the DuPont Irish. So these are people who come from Ulster, and they transfer across to Delaware to work in DuPont factories. And then within a relatively short period of time, they're demarcating themselves, lace curtain Irish and all of that. So completely agree, they are a complicated grouping, and I suspect, well, I'm only echoing what people said at the time, there is a sense in some of the contemporary accounts that those least likely to attend to their sort of religious duties and religious faith tend to be those which are, this is an argument that's put forward by, I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's an argument that's put forward, are those who are on the sort of lowest sort of socio-economic step of the ladder.
I'd say one of the other touch points is chain migration, and where people move from in mass and where they're settled. Because I think that ties in with the community, but I think it also ties in with the sort of the perpetuation of those communities from overseas.
Yeah, if I could just quick follow up on that. There was an assumption, when people say about Ireland, that's a peasant society. That's just rubbish, because within Irish society, Irish agricultural society, there's huge gradations. So outsiders came, they said these people all look the same, they all act the same, and then they find out that, someone is a farmer with 50 acres and someone's so there's huge. So those gradations are naturally going to transfer across to Atlantic, or indeed to Britain. The people who are most likely to emigrate are not the tenant farmers with 40, 50 acres. They were maybe leaving in the early part. They tend to be the people who are most affected by the sort of ravages of the economy. But there's a whole, I would say it's probably hundreds of studies of Irish American communities which basically illustrate your point.
All right, well, again, thank you, and thanks to all of you. It's been wonderful to see some of our regulars, but it's great to see so many new faces. So there is a list in front of you of Cushwa events for the rest of the semester. Please come back and join us for any and all of them. And please join me in thanking Professor Delaney for